Hello and welcome back everyone, we Weeb Online, and today I'm gonna continue the story What If Kid Naruto Met the Broken Minato Part 2. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
Here we are, Minato exclaimed with as much enthusiasm as he could muster. Naruto had been quiet since leaving the Hokage Tower, particularly the room containing the crystal glass. Minato wasn't sure if this was typical for the boy, and he knew surprisingly little about Naruto. But that didn't stop him from trying to lighten the mood. Arriving at the house seemed to divert their attention. Minato smiled as Naruto swiveled his head from side to side, taking in as much of the house as he could. The building was normally used by the Hokage and was located in a quieter section of the village, away from the busy center but still within the walls. It wasn't the most opulent home in the neighborhood. It was old, and other, larger houses had been built since its construction, but it still held a calm dignity. On either side, a small garden and lawn surrounded it, though the grounds appeared overgrown. The house was 2 stories tall, with a traditional style that was beautiful in its simplicity. To be honest, the house was too big for Minato, and he despised returning to it at night. He only used a few rooms inside and spent as much time as possible away from it. He considered downsizing to a smaller apartment on occasion. There was no rule or law requiring the Hokage to live there, but Kushina had fallen in love with the house. Minato stayed because she had once said that it reminded her of the houses in Whirlpool before her country was destroyed. Minato unlocked the door, fumbling with the folders thrust upon him by a frantic clerk before leaving the tower. He pushed his son inside and turned around to look for his sensei. The Toad Sage had mysteriously vanished shortly after leaving the tower. Minato was relieved to have a few moments alone with Naruto without Jiraiya's watchful eyes scrutinizing every interaction between the two or movement from the boy. But another part of him wondered what the old man was up to. Minato didn't want to spend another afternoon smoothing over complaints from half the village's young women. Minato kicked the door shut with one foot and dropped his heavy stack of paperwork on the nearest flat surface before taking off his sandals. He stared at the stack, quietly cursing his inability to flee without drawing the clerk's attention. The desk ninja's expression had quickly changed from shock to panic after learning that the Hokage was leaving for an undetermined amount of time without completing the morning's reports. With one last glance at the dreaded pile, Minato was fairly certain that the reports would not be completed at the house with Naruto present than if they had both stayed in his empty office. Minato smiled at Naruto as the boy looked around the house, both inside and out. The entrance hall was one of the few places Minato still made an effort to keep in good condition. The furniture was simple and elegant in dark wood, and much of it predated Minato's stay. When visitors came to the house, they mostly stayed in the entrance hall or the sitting room beyond the first main door. Naruto walked around the hall's edge, closely inspecting everything in reach, pulling open drawers and peering into the closet. He approached the sitting room door and peered inside, Minato following behind him and doing the same. When he saw the state of the room, the older blonde cringed. It was relatively clean and clutter-free, with 2 couches facing each other in the center of the room and a low coffee table. The few extra chairs and side tables around the walls, as well as the large bookshelf lining the far wall, were straight. The only thing out of place were the books that were strewn about the room, stacked on the coffee table, side tables, and couch cushions rather than on the designated shelves. "I meant to pick those up," Minato grumbled as he drew Naruto away from the sitting room. "Well, I guess we should find you a room to stay in first," he said louder as he led the boy to the stairs. Naruto looked up, surprised and excited by his expression. "So I get to stay here?" he inquired, his eyes wide and bright. "Do you mind if I ask?" "Of course I don't mind," Minato said, half distracted as he considered available bedrooms. "I'm glad to have you stay," he said, coming out of his thoughts just long enough to smile down at his son. Minato began leading the way up the stairs but stopped when he couldn't hear any footsteps behind him. He returned his gaze to the ground. Naruto remained at the bottom of the stairs, frowning at the steps ahead of him. "Is that Naruto-kun?" Minato inquired. "What are you doing?" Naruto inquired, looking up at him. Minato was struck by the confusion and glimmer of suspicion in Naruto's eyes, and for the first time, he wondered what kind of life Naruto had growing up alone in the village. He would not have expected his son to be abandoned if things had been different. Even so, it was the little things, behavioral tics, reactions, and comments like the last one that made Minato nervous. He had a sinking feeling he wouldn't like what he discovered about Naruto's life in the mirror world. It was yet another item on the ever-expanding list of topics to discuss with the Sandaime, but he pushed it to the side. It was a subject for another time and place. Right now, his priority was to provide Naruto with a room for the night. Minato retraced his steps down the stairs and knelt level with the boy. "I'm doing this because I want to, because you're my son," he added silently. He was tempted to just tell Naruto the truth, but he didn't know where to start, or how to continue the conversation if he did. He found himself reaching out and grasping Naruto's shoulders instead. "I understand this is probably very confusing, but I promise I'll explain, at least what I understand. First, let's find you a place to stay." Naruto locked his gaze on Minato for a long moment, and the man had the uneasy feeling that he was being weighed and measured. The confusion remained on Naruto's face, but his frown softened and his eyes brightened. Then, in a burst of energy, Naruto dashed up the stairs, pulling away from Minato's grip. "Right, do I get my own room?" "Which one?" he exclaimed, his bare feet pattering on the wooden stairs. Minato surprisedly blinked and dashed to catch up. "Some of the rooms aren't quite ready for someone to stay in them," he said as he reached the second floor and noticed Naruto peering into the first door on the right. "That's my office," he said as he drew the boy away from the half-open door. He caught a fleeting glimpse of the workspace, which was littered with books, scrolls, and half-finished ceiling experiments, and imagined what the sitting room could become if left alone for another few weeks. "You're not to go in there unless I give you permission or it's an emergency. There's sensitive material in there, and I don't want you to get hurt, understood?" Minato slammed the door shut. There were some dangerous scrolls inside, and several of the projects he was working on were not appropriate for an academy student. He reminded himself to secure the door with security seals just in case. Fortunately, the 8-year-old seemed uninterested in the room. Naruto shrugged and dashed through the next door. Minato followed suit, wrinkled his brow at the state of the adjacent room. The single bedroom was covered in dust. The floor was littered with boxes, and the bed frame was devoid of its mattress. Minato noticed it leaning against a corner. It took him a moment to recall that the room had been converted to storage years before. "This one will not do. You can say that again," Naruto mumbled as he drew away from the door and walked down the hall to the left of the stairwell. The next room was in a similar state, but it lacked the boxes and at least had a mattress on the bed. Minato felt surprisingly embarrassed looking into rooms he hadn't visited in years. "I haven't needed to use these rooms in a long time." "That's fine," Naruto said as he walked to the next door. The act of exploring seemed to excite him more than anything else. "I, too, dislike cleaning," Minato muttered to himself. That was not the impression he wished to leave on his son. He was a really nice guy. He had always been the neater of the two when compared to Kushina, aside from the habit of leaving his reading everywhere. Most of the rooms in the house were simply unnecessary given how little he was there, so he never used them. He added cleaning the house to his to-do list. Perhaps he'll have some genin go through the empty rooms as a D-rank mission. The third room was more surprising than the previous two. Minato stopped when he saw Jiraiya running a hand over a plain bureau, the Sannin's large pack sitting on the bed, and curtains rustling on either side of an open window. "Minato-kun, you need a maid," the older man said before Minato could respond. "Preferably one who is young, pretty, and single." The comment made the bachelor Hokage roll his eyes. "What are you doing, sensei?" he asked as he pushed the door open wider, allowing Naruto to enter the room. This one didn't appear to be too bad. There was only a thin layer of dust on the bed, and it was already made. He noticed the pack sitting on the same bed as him. "How does it look?" Jiraiya asked, brushing the dust from his hands and smiling at the two blondes. "Here I am in town, in need of a place to stay. And what better place to stay than at my old student's house? He has more room than he can stand and wouldn't turn away an old friend." "No bathhouse this time?" Minato inquired, his face tinged with a knowing smirk. "What? And neglect my favorite student?" Jiraiya exclaimed, surprised. "It's almost as if you don't want me to stay. Which hurts because I thought you'd enjoy the company." Minato rolled his eyes again, but this time the smile was more of a relief than a chuckle. Minato was beginning to feel a little out of his element. He'd been living alone for so long, and now he was responsible for an 8-year-old. The thought of having help was a relief, and it meant that his sensei would be nearby to assist him in any situation. "Wouldn't we be grateful for the company, Naruto-kun?" Naruto appeared surprised to be included in the statement, his wide, surprised eyes shooting up to Minato's smiling face, then to Jiraiya's, before a low smile spread across his own. "Yeah," Naruto exclaimed, a little too loudly, "that'd be great. Now there's 3 of us. We just need to find one more room then." And he was out the door and down the hall. Minato followed the blonde hair streak and saw Naruto open the door to another room, which he recognized as a closet. Like Kushina, the boy's enthusiasm was contagious, and he smiled back at Jiraiya, who was shaking his head. That kid better not be that energetic all the time. I'm too old to deal with loud brats. The man's smile as he turned to face his pack undercut the complaint. He'll probably run you into the ground if he is. Old man, Minato said, before adding, he'll probably run me into the ground. I wonder where he gets it all. He remembered the seal on Naruto's stomach. After everything that had happened, he had forgotten about it. Here, look at this. Tell me what you think of it in private after we find Naruto a room, Minato said, reaching into his pocket for the scroll on which he had copied Naruto's seal. Jiraiya looked at him and then at the outstretched scroll because of his solemn tone. He took the scroll, opening it and quickly scanning the contents. This is one of your seals, he said, his brow furrowed. Not quite, it's been changed, Minato explained. He hurried out of the room after hearing another door close beyond the closet down the hall. Please review it carefully and let me know what you think. They eventually settled on a room next to Minato's. It was as dusty as the others, but it had a full set of furniture, and a large window that Naruto adored. Despite his claim that he despises cleaning, Naruto appeared to be excited enough about the prospect of having his own room in the shared house to attack the dust that was contaminating it. They'd have to get Naruto some new clothes and other necessities, but Minato was pleased enough with the day's progress to postpone that for another day. He handed the boy a bucket of water and some rags, promising to return in an hour or so after speaking with Jiraiya. The older man sat on the bed in the room he'd claimed as his own, inspecting the seal. His brow furrowed in concentration, and his packed bag had been shifted to the floor. Minato crept into the room and closed the door behind him. He walked over to a chair pushed up against the desk next to the window and sat down to wait, turning to face his sensei. Jiraiya remained silent for several minutes before opening his mouth to speak. This is one of your seals, he said without looking up, and I remember when you were working on it. I'm not sure I've caught all the changes you mentioned, but I've noticed a few. When did you make those? I didn't, Minato said, leaning back and crossing his arms and legs, but I did find that seal on Naruto's stomach. Jiraiya's head shot up, his wide eyes meeting Minato's. This was on Naruto's stomach, he exclaimed, amazed. Minato did not wait for another cue. When I found him, he was wounded, not seriously, but enough to put him in shock and cause blood loss. I brought him to the hospital, and the nurse there said he was healing quickly. I discovered the seal while removing his ruined clothing. You say accelerated healing. Jiraiya returned her gaze to the seal, her fingers tracing over parts of it. Well, that explains some of the additions. These additions are for the recycling chakra. I'm guessing the other you in Naruto's world made those additions, and given the original purpose of the seal, he looked up to Minato for confirmation. Minato leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and looked down at his hands. For the first time, he expressed his concerns. I think Naruto is a Jinchuriki and I think I turned him into one. The statement was met with silence. It stretched until Minato couldn't take it any longer. He raised his head. Jiraiya was staring at him, his posture mirroring his. You did not harm him. An alternate version of myself did. That wasn't you, it was someone else, someone in a different situation and making different decisions, Jiraiya said firmly, his gaze steady. Minato wasn't sure he trusted his teacher, and a part of him was still twisted with guilt at the thought of doing such a thing to his son. Kushina had never spoken much about being the Kyuubi's Jinchuriki, but he could see the pain it had caused her. He would never wish such a life for his son. It still doesn't explain what happened to him when we went to see the crystal glass earlier. Jiraiya's voice drew Minato out of his reverie before he could sink any deeper. No, it doesn't, agreed the younger man, leaning back and diverting his attention away from his darker thoughts. I've never seen anything like that, and I'm not sure what triggered it. Could have been a dozen different things. Naruto is the first person I've heard of who has traveled between possible worlds, Jiraiya agreed. He rolled up the scroll with Naruto's seal and slid it into his bag. I don't even know how to begin predicting what traveling between the two would do to a human body, let alone a person's mind. Perhaps we should consult Tsunade. Minato nodded, his gaze roving over the bare wood floor, briefly resting on Jiraiya's sandals by the wall. The boards needed to be swept and mopped. For far too long, the entire house had been neglected. Like the dust in the unopened rooms, he had the impression that a large part of his life had been neglected as well. Minato snorted at himself, admitting that he needed more sleep. He drew his wandering thoughts back to the problem at hand. Then there's the time right before he arrived that he doesn't remember. Anything could have happened in that time. Jiraiya agreed with a nod and a grunt. Talking to the Sandaime would undoubtedly clear things up. But if the enemy has taken control of their tower and gained access to the crystal Minato side, it was only noon and he was already exhausted. We'll never know unless we try, and there will always be some risk, the older man explained. Jiraiya rose to his feet, picking up his pack and placing it back on the bed. You're tired, and we won't be able to find out much more for now, so let's take a few hours at least to let things sink in. I'm going to be staying for longer than planned, so you better have some sake downstairs or you're going to have a grumpy house guest," he said as he tipped the bag upside down and poured the contents onto the bedspread. Minato stood up and nodded in agreement. "I wonder if there's any food in the kitchen," he exclaimed as he walked out the door. He'd check on Naruto before heading to the kitchen to check on their food supplies. He couldn't remember the last time he went grocery shopping, which told him he'd be stopping by the market later that day. Takeout was not going to suffice for a growing boy. "I have the report, Hokage-sama," the ANBU said, crouched low in front of Sarutobi and the table strewn with maps and papers. "Proceed," the old Hokage said, his gaze never leaving the intricate street map of Konoha's eastern quarter. "Hi," the ANBU said with a slight bow of the head. "The enemy has taken approximately 60% of the village. Most of the residential districts, as well as the front gate in the Hokage Tower, have been overrun. We have suffered heavy losses, but so have the invading forces. Most of our high-ranking shinobi are still alive, and the majority is able to fight. There has been no report on the high-ranking enemy shinobi." "Very well," Sarutobi said as he looked down at the man kneeling in front of him. The ANBU's uniform was stained with blood and dirt, and it was dirty and torn. Who knew how long the shinobi had been fighting and awake? "Take a few hours to rest, eat, and sleep. I can still fight, Hokage-sama," the ANBU objected, stiffening in response to the order. With the wisdom of a man who had seen too many wars, Sarutobi shook his head. "You'll be no good if you collapse from exhaustion. You'll do far better if you take the opportunity to rest while you can, otherwise, you become a danger to your comrades." "Hi, Hokage-sama. There is one more observation from the front lines. The Iwa forces are forming their main line of defense through the village, but the Angakure forces appear to be concentrating on and around the Hokage Tower," the ANBU replied. The announcement caused Sarutobi to pause and deepen his frown. "All right, get some rest and then prepare for our counter-offensive, which will begin at nightfall." The ANBU bowed low once more and exited the room. Sarutobi returned to his maps, but they were gone. His thoughts were on the report he'd just received. While it was reassuring to know that his most effective shinobi were still alive, he was saddened to learn that so many of their youngest had died. Men and women who hadn't even had a chance to live their lives. It reminded him of the Shinobi Wars, a time he didn't want to relive in his remaining years. The most disturbing news, however, was the enemy's distribution. He had a feeling that, while Iwa supplied the majority of the troops for the attack, he was not the true antagonist. Angakure, in his opinion, was the more dangerous of the two and was most likely the instigator. They now had control of the Hokage Tower. Sarutobi's thoughts immediately returned to the crystal mirror he'd used to communicate with Minato while sitting in the tower's depths. He couldn't imagine how the enemy could be aware of its existence. The likelihood of them stumbling over it was even lower, but whether they were aware of it or not, accidental discovery or not, the danger remained. Sarutobi's mind raced to his personal notes and research, which contained the seal he had used to send Naruto safely through. He had ordered its destruction, along with the destruction of other sensitive information that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands, but he had been unable to personally supervise it. Sarutobi shook his head and refocused on the maps in front of him. Shikaku, the chief strategist, went over potential plans and their likelihood of success. He couldn't undo the fact that his notes had been completely destroyed. The best thing they could do at this point was retake the tower and drive the enemy out of their strongholds. Anything else would have to wait its turn. Kakashi landed on the front steps of the Hokage Tower exhausted, filthy, hungry, and more than anything, relieved to be home. His shower and bed both called to him, but both would have to wait until he reported to the Hokage. Just a quick hello to Minato-sensei to let him know he was still alive. Then he'd be able to douse himself in hot water and sleep for at least a few days before anyone asked about his mission report. Keeping that in mind, Kakashi trudged through the doors and up the stairs to the Hokage's office. He barely noticed the frantic activity around him as he moved through the hall, intent only on seeing his sensei, and then leaving. However, his path was blocked when he collided with a CH-nin exiting Minato's office. They collided, papers spilling from the desk ninja's hands across the floor. "Oh, excuse me, ANBU-san," the CH-nin said distractedly as he bent down to pick up the papers, a dismayed expression on his face. "Don't worry about it, Ma," Kakashi said. He really should help pick those up, but bending down that far seemed excessive. He moved to go around and through the door, but he was stopped by the CH-nin before he could grasp the handle. "If you're looking for Hokage-sama, he isn't here," the CH-nin said, shuffling the papers in his hands, looking even more disappointed. Isn't he here? Kakashi inquired, vaguely aware that he sounded slower than the average ANBU. But if the other shinobi couldn't tell by smell alone that he had just returned from a mission, the CH-nin had no hope. Nonetheless, Minato-sensei was always present in the office. How do you know he's not here? He isn't here, the CH-nin said, sounding increasingly agitated. He's taken a day off. Yesterday he was only in for a few hours, and then today he came by to say he was taking a personal day. These papers need to be signed. He shook the pile with both hands to emphasize his point. Kakashi was more concerned with the fact that Minato suddenly seemed to be taking time for himself than with signing papers. Minato-sensei had never taken a day off in the previous 8 years. The Hokage's last personal day had been for the birth of his son. It had not gone well. The CH-nin was still babbling about forms and papers that needed to be signed and approved, cancelled meetings, and obtaining consent for matters that couldn't be decided without the Hokage's approval. None of this mattered to Kakashi. All he cared about was checking in, proving to his sensei that he was still alive and well, ensuring that his sensei was alive and well, and then collapsing into bed. With that thought in mind, and feeling a little more awake as a result of the turn of events, Kakashi turned away from the babbling CH-nin and returned down the hall to the nearest window. When the CH-nin ran ahead of him and held out the papers, he was stopped once more. If you're going to see him, ANBU-san, could you please take these to Hokage-sama? They need to be signed today. Kakashi took the papers primarily to get the CH-nin out of the way. He was too exhausted to deal with desk shinobi, and the path of least resistance appeared to be the best option at the time. With a tired wave of his hand, Kakashi brushed away the Chunin's quick bow of thanks, and the CH-nin vanished in the opposite direction. Kakashi rolled up the forms and pushed open the first window he came to before leaping across the street to the nearest building. It took longer than usual to get to the house. Kakashi was exhausted, even with the boost of energy he'd gotten from hearing about Minato's unusual behavior. He didn't even bother moving to the front door when he arrived at the house. Instead, he made his way to the nearest window, landing tiredly on the ledge and sliding open the window. Kakashi froze when he saw a miniature Minato sitting on the sitting room floor, crayons and papers strewn around him. For a split second, his mind went blank when he saw the identical, if smaller, blonde head. He reached up to rub his eye but had to stop because he was still wearing his ANBU mask. Instead of pushing through, he should have taken an hour or two on the way back to the village to nap. He was experiencing hallucinations. The blonde head then lifted to reveal an identical set of blue eyes that landed on Kakashi's perch in the window. The boy exclaimed, pointing accusingly at the masked man. It's you. Me. The ANBU asked, perplexed, trying to think of any reason why a miniature replica of his sensei would recognize him or how such a boy could exist. Is everything okay? I thought I heard a yell, Minato said as he emerged from around the corner, dressed in his blue shinobi uniform but lacking his Hokage coat and jounin vest. He came to a halt when he saw Kakashi crouched on the windowsill, half in the room. Oh, you're back, that's great. Hokage-sama, Kakashi said as he entered the room with a small bow. He looked at the boy who was still sitting on the floor, then back at Minato, astounded by their resemblance. You look exhausted, Minato said, running his gaze up and down Kakashi's tired body. He paused for a brief moment of thought before continuing with a casual wave. And you need a bath. I'll get your report later, go home, bathe, sleep, and eat. You have the next 2 weeks to recover from your last assignment. Oh, and if you see Kakashi, tell him I'd like to see him tomorrow morning and not sooner. The last was said in a firm tone that indicated to Kakashi that his sensei was serious. Minato's eyes were wide with curiosity as the ANBU looked down at him from the floor. Something was wrong with him. Kakashi couldn't shake the feeling that it should have been obvious. With a little thought, he should be able to figure it out, but his brain was slow and his mind sluggish. He'd been away on a mission for too long, and he pushed himself too hard to return too soon. He wouldn't solve any mysteries, no matter how obvious, until he'd gotten some rest. Kakashi sighed, wanting to know but also wanting to sleep in his own bed. Hello, Hokage-sama. They wanted you to sign these forms, he said belatedly, taking the papers from the window sill. He moved his gaze to the window. Minato didn't appear to be in any trouble right now. The man appeared fine, healthy, and even a little happier than Kakashi remembered seeing him in recent years. Kakashi, reassured that nothing was wrong and in desperate need of rest, slipped out the window and took the shortest route home. Who was that? Naruto inquired, raising his gaze to Minato. That was Dog, Minato said, moving to sit next to Naruto on the couch. He's one of my most trusted ANBU. What were you yelling about earlier? Naruto shuffled around to face Minato, but remained seated on the floor. The books had been removed from the shelves and replaced. Minato and Jiraiya had made certain that any books with questionable or dangerous content were placed on the highest shelves, out of reach of the 8-year-old. Minato intended to move the books in question to his office once it was cleaned, organized, and had enough space, but the office was still a disaster. The sheets of paper and crayons fanned out around Naruto, depicting his many masterpieces of art, were the only thing out of place in the sitting room. Looking at some of the closest drawings, Minato recognized Kushina's artistic ability, or lack thereof. If he wanted Naruto to become a seal master, he'd have to put in a little extra effort. I think I've seen that mask before, Naruto said, carefully inspecting the tip of a blunt crayon before tossing it to the floor and focusing his full attention on Minato. Do you have? Minato inquired. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped. He considered the implications of that fact. That was the mask the guy who brought me to the Hokage was wearing. I might have seen him before that, but those masked guys don't stick around for long. Naruto shrugged, fiddling with another crayon, peeling the paper wrapping off more than was necessary. Minato knew it wasn't a given, but there was a chance that the Kakashi in Naruto's world was also dog. It could mean that his student was looking after his son in that other location, which was a reassuring thought. Minato, on the other hand, would have preferred that Kakashi adopt Naruto if the child became orphaned. Minato wouldn't be surprised if his own Kakashi was hesitant to make such a commitment, considering all the hurt the man carried as well as his stigma about families. Minato paused briefly before silently preparing for his next question. He wasn't sure if he wanted to ask or learn, but his curiosity won out. Who looks after you there? He asked, relieved by his casual tone. Oh, Naruto shifted and scratched the back of his head with his hand. The old man comes and checks in on me now and then, but I have my own place, and I don't need anyone to look after me. Naruto smiled up. Returning the smile took some effort. Naruto's broad grin didn't deceive him. He could see the brittleness beneath it. He knew about the months he spent perfecting it until it concealed his loneliness from everyone. But Minato saw right through it. He'd used the same expression several times to reassure his sensei and students that he was fine after Kushina's death. It hadn't worked on them either at the time. That expression should not have come from his son. No one else. He wondered aloud. Well, Iruka-sensei sometimes takes me out to ramen, and he gets me Ikaraku's ramen, which is the best in the world, Naruto exclaimed. However, he also yells at me when I get in trouble, and not just at school. Minato's face relaxed into a genuine grin. Iruka, you say? Minato had seen the man around the village but had never really gotten to know him. That's because he cares about you, Minato explained, reminiscing about the academy instructor. Minato had seen and heard that the younger man was a bit of a mother hen. Before returning to the conversation and forcing himself to continue, he made a mental note to pay more attention to the man in the future. Do you know what happened to your parents? Naruto didn't respond right away this time, squirming in his seat as he looked down at the rainbow of crayons scattered around him. He shrugged, attempting to be casual. I don't know. No one ever told me, he said flatly, refusing to answer further questions. Minato hesitated to continue, wincing. Naruto hunched in on himself, a slight curl to his shoulders as he examined his crayon collection. Minato chose his words with care. Do you remember what we talked about yesterday morning, Naruto-kun? The younger blonde looked up at Minato, perplexed. About how things differ here from your own Konoha, Minato said, hoping to jog Naruto's memory. He spoke slowly, searching for the right words. People who have left here, like the Sandaime, are in your Konoha, and people who have left your Konoha may still be here. Naruto looked at him, still puzzled by what Minato was saying. There was an awkward silence between them. Minato wiped his brow with his hand as he struggled to find the right words to express himself. Just telling the child the news seemed too harsh. He tried a different angle, biting back a frustrated groan. Did you know I was an orphan as a kid? You? Naruto inquired, his voice rising with surprise. He sat up a little straighter and dropped the crayon he'd been playing with to focus entirely on the older man. Minato nodded, encouraged by Naruto's newfound interest in him and the intensity in the boy's gaze. So I understand what it's been like for you a little, he grimaced, considering the additional complications that being a Jinchuriki would bring. The stumble had sapped his energy, but he persisted. I know it's probably difficult to believe that someone out there will be there for you, but, as I said, this is a new world for you, right? There are different circumstances here, so just because you didn't have anyone there doesn't mean it's the same here. Minato shook his head as Naruto's bewilderment returned, though there was a spark of an idea behind his eyes. The boy drew his arms across his chest, his face scrunched in concentration. So you mean I might be able to find someone to look after me here? He asked, still skeptical. No, I mean you have someone already here. Minato shifted in his seat and ran his hand across his face in frustration. The subtle approach was clearly not working. Naruto clearly required things to be stated clearly, as Kushina had. What I'm attempting to convey is, man, am I hungry, exclaimed Jiraiya, interrupting Minato and drowning out what he was about to say. Anyway, when are we going to eat? I know this great ramen stand in town. Both blondes looked at him, one face brightening at the mention of lunch, the other narrowing his eyes at the interruption. Naruto jumped to his feet, punching the air with glee. Yeah, ramen, exclaimed the boy, forgetting the previous conversation. Oh, Jiraiya exclaimed, matching Naruto's exuberance. You like ramen, then? It's the best. Naruto agreed, a fervent nod and a wide smile on his face. And Ikaraku's ramen is the best of all. Can we go there? He ran up to the white-haired man, hands clenched and body tense in anticipation, scattering a few more drawings and crayons across the floor. Jiraiya smiled as she ruffled Naruto's hair. Isn't it fortunate that that's exactly where I was planning on going? I'd say stay here for lunch, but I still don't trust Minato cooking Kun's abilities. He's so out of practice. Naruto let out another joyful whoop and danced on the spot before sprinting to the door. I'm going to get my sandals. Jiraiya turned to see Naruto walk away. Minato, on the other hand, kept his gaze fixed on his sensei throughout the conversation. The Hokage's expression was no more forgiving than it had been when the Sannin had first interrupted and he had remained seated on the couch. Minato slowly rose from his perch now that Naruto had left. Do you realize how bad your timing is, sensei? Jiraiya shrugged, unaffected by Minato's gloomy expression. I've been told that before, but in this case, I believe I'm on time. I was about to explain to him, Minato said, turning to the papers on the floor and bending to pick them up in quick movements. Jiraiya sighed and went to assist Minato. That's exactly my point. It's too soon to tell him those things. There's still so much we don't know. Don't know, Minato said, looking up from his cleaning and observing his sensei rearranging some of the bright crayon drawings. His voice was muted to a lower level when he spoke again. He's my son, and he's been alone his entire life. That's all I need to know. Minato could feel a few crayons snap from pressure in his grip. Jiraiya snatched up the last few photos, taking his time before responding. I know, and that's why we have to be careful about how we do things and what we tell him. He's been through enough without giving him false hope. Look. Jiraiya's shoulder dropped slightly, his voice low and serious. With his hands at his sides, he turned to face Minato squarely. You're my student, and for all practical purposes, he's my godson. I don't want either of you to be hurt if I can avoid it. We still don't know all the facts of what happened over there. We don't know if Naruto will even be able to stay here. There's no way to tell if the Sandame's technique used to send him here is permanent or if it has side effects that could be harmful. Minato remained silent. There was nothing else to say. He stood motionless, his shoulders slumped and his gaze lowered to the floor as he realized he wouldn't be able to keep Naruto. The thought had never occurred to him, and now that it had, he couldn't stop the cold hand that gripped his heart. Hell, Jiraiya continued, his voice more thoughtful, as if speaking mostly to himself. They might even demand that we return him. Naruto is, after all, the other Kano has Jinchuriki, and they won't let him go so easily. They'd have a fight on their hands, Minato said quickly. He tensed after saying the words, feeling Jiraiya's disapproving gaze on his back. Another crayon broke in his grip. There was a long period of silence during which neither man moved. Jiraiya then returned his focus to the drawings in his hands, leafing through them absently. I'm just saying we need to know more about the situation before we do anything rash. You're already in this situation. Let's spare the brat the same anxiety until we know for sure, okay? Minato finally raised his head from the floor. I suppose you're right, and I suppose this leaves us with little choice but to try to contact the Sandame. He looked at Jiraiya, who was frozen in place, staring at a picture with muted shock. What's the matter? Jiraiya turned the drawing around to face Minato without saying anything. The Hokage had no idea what had irritated the older man at first. The image appeared to be a slightly lopsided image of a very gnarled tree that stretched across the entire page. When he opened his mouth to ask what was wrong, his eyes were drawn to what his sensei had seen. The leaves that covered the top half of the page were actually a section of a seal, a very complicated and extensive seal. Minato took the paper, his gaze sweeping over the green crayon marks before returning to the pictures in his hand. He shuffled through them, carefully scanning the images, while Jiraiya did the same with the papers he'd already read. Minato discovered clear sections of a seal in several pictures, as well as areas in other pictures that could have been part of a seal but were too clumsy due to the crayon to tell. What is this? Minato asked, not expecting an answer but feeling compelled to ask. He eventually returned to the first page, which had the tree and the largest example of the seal he'd seen. He couldn't tell much from the small section, but he could tell that the examples drawn out for them were only parts of a much larger seal, one he'd never seen before, and that Naruto shouldn't be able to draw at all. "I'm not sure," Jiraiya said, pulling out a specific drawing that Minato assumed contained other examples of partially drawn seal diagrams. "But the sooner we talk to Sensei, the better." "Oi!" Naruto exclaimed, jolting both men out of their reverie. "Are we going or not? I'm starving." "We're on our way," Minato said as Jiraiya snatched the papers from his grasp. Jiraiya stowed the drawings safely inside his shirt as he looked at the older man. Jiraiya gave Minato one last serious look before brightening his face and turning to Naruto before walking to the door. "You must learn patience, brat. A shinobi must have patience if they are to excel." "Patience?" Naruto asked again, his face screwed up at the thought. "But I'm hungry now. Perhaps we should wait a little longer so you can learn the lesson." Jiraiya joked as Naruto's jaw dropped open in horror. Minato followed them into the entrance hall, trying to concentrate on his sensei and his son's light banter. The discovery and implications of the seals buried in Naruto's photographs raced through his mind, as did the possibility that Naruto wouldn't be able to stay. It was too much to think about at the time. He needed to wait until he had some peace and quiet to sort it all out before speaking with Jiraiya in depth. With one final mental push, he pushed the worrying thought aside and focused on enjoying lunch with his son. "You brat, stop moving." Naruto's squirming stopped, but he narrowed his eyes at his tormentor, a defiant pout on his face. "I don't see why I need another exam when I was just in the hospital." Brown eyes returned to Naruto as both medic and patient exchanged stares, neither wanting to look away first. "Sure," Naruto thought as the medic repositioned him on the desk as he tried to squirm away again. The medic lady was a pretty blonde, but she had a bad temper and her bedside manner was lacking. Tsunade was her name, according to Minato and Jiraiya. Naruto initially thought she was young, but then he discovered she was Jiraiya's teammate. That made her old, much older than she appeared. As he made a verbal comment on that observation, Naruto failed to notice that Tsunade's bedside manner had vanished. "Please bear with us for a little while longer, Naruto-kun," said the other medic, a lady named Rin. She was a brunette with two thick purple marks from jaw to cheek on either side of her face, and she was much nicer than old lady Tsunade. "All we want to do is make sure you're completely healed." Naruto huffed but remained silent to allow the two women to finish inspecting him with glowing hands. He looked to the side of the sitting room, relieved to see Minato still leaning against the couch, arms crossed across his chest. With bright eyes and a twitching mouth, the Hokage observed the proceedings. He appeared to be fighting a smile. Naruto took a deep breath and braced himself for the never-ending exam. It was taking far too long for a quick checkup. He'd never had a medic examine him for so long or so thoroughly, let alone two at the same time. They spent a lot of time on his stomach, which tickled and made him squirm, earning Tsunade another growl. The silence fell over the room. Naruto's mind wandered, bored with everything and wanting to jump off the desk they'd pulled out from the wall for him to sit on during the exam. Minato had refused to return to the hospital for it. He hadn't explained why, but Naruto wasn't going to complain. Naruto's thoughts returned to the thing that had remained in the back of his mind, drawn to it like metal to a magnet. When he wasn't distracted by something else, whenever he had a moment to think for himself, they inevitably focused on the half-thought that he still couldn't remember. It had something to do with the old man. Naruto was fairly certain, because whenever he thought about the Sandaime, the sensation grew stronger. Tsunade hummed thoughtfully, drawing Naruto's attention away from his circling thoughts. Her hands had moved to his head. He could see her face scrunched in concentration through the soft green glow that encircled her hands and, by extension, Naruto's head. It was only a brief moment before the woman dropped her hands and returned to her bag. Rin's hands were now the only ones pressing into his back, but they were quickly removed as well. The brunette took some paper from the table and began scribbling notes across the white sheets. Tsunade motioned with one hand to his arm. The other was holding a syringe and a needle. Naruto grimaced, not wanting to get stuck with a needle, but his gaze returned to Minato, and he straightened his back and stuck out his arm. He didn't flinch when the needle poked into his skin, which was surprisingly gentle considering it was Tsunade doing it. He was determined to be courageous in the presence of his hero. After all, Naruto didn't want Minato to think he was afraid of something as insignificant as a needle. Things were going so well, and Minato seemed to like Naruto a lot. Naruto couldn't think of a better morning in his life, from the moment they awoke to Minato's burnt breakfast, forcing them to eat only toast, to the lunch out with Jiraiya at Ikaraku's. He didn't want to ruin things by giving Minato a reason to dislike him. As he watched Tsunade draw blood from his arms and fill the syringe, He held his breath and tried to ignore the slightly queasy feeling in his stomach. "You're doing very well," Rin said again, and Naruto returned the smile, grateful for the distraction as the needle was removed from his arm. Tsunade put the needle in her small medical bag and capped it. "Well, that's it," she said, turning to Minato. "I wonder why you had both myself and Rin-san over here, Minato-kun." "The kid's fine, for the most part. The wound is all healed, surprisingly quickly, though it might still be sore for a little while longer. He's underweight, too, but I'm sure you'll fix that if you don't kill him first." As Jiraiya entered the room, Minato rolled his eyes. "What, done already?" asked the newcomer, peering between Tsunade, Rin, and Minato. "What do you mean already?" Naruto jumped up from the table. "That took an eternity." "It wasn't that bad." Rin chuckled as she ruffled Naruto's hair before taking the notes from the desk. She looked at Minato. "Sensei, perhaps we can find something for Naruto to do while we discuss things further." "What? Why can't I be in the discussion?" Naruto inquired, feeling a little left out at the prospect of everyone leaving to discuss him. "You wouldn't be interested anyway. It'll be boring medical talk that will probably just go over your head, and it'll all come down to you eating more vegetables," Jiraiya said as he walked over to Naruto and poked him in the head. He took the notes from Rin's grasp and took out the blank sheets before turning Naruto around to face the desk once more. He slapped blank sheets of paper and a pencil on the desk. "Why don't you draw me some pictures while the adults go talk about boring adult things in the other room?" Naruto glared at the older man as Jiraiya and Tsunade exited the room. Rin smiled as she followed the other two out of the door. "Don't worry, Naruto-kun," Minato said as he ruffled Naruto's hair. "We shouldn't be here for too long." "Fine," huffed Naruto before smiling. "After that, could you teach me some cool ninja stuff so I can be better than everyone when I return to the academy?" Minato's grin widened even more. "I'd love to teach you something after we're finished, but please be patient until then. Your earlier drawings were very nice, and I'd like to see more." "All right," Naruto said. He wasn't particularly interested in drawing more because he'd already done so before lunch, but if Minato wanted to see more of his drawings, he'd be happy to draw more. Naruto drew the chair out and sat down, hearing the door click shut as he drew the paper and pencil toward him. He'd have to draw some really good pictures because no one had ever wanted to see his before, so he'd have to make these count. Naruto began his work with his tongue between his teeth. Sarutobai's face was set in a frown. It felt etched there, permanent and unchanging except for an increase in severity. Despite the good news about their efforts against the Iwa shinobi, his gaze was drawn to the point on the map depicting the Hokage Tower. It remained out of reach, under the control of the Aimgakure shinobi. "If I didn't know better, I'd say the Aimgakure forces knew what we were planning," Kakashi said, his slumped posture too authentic for those who knew him well to tell the difference. Sarutobi was familiar with him and could see the exhaustion in Kakashi's stance. The Iwa nin had no idea what hit them, which means that either Iwa wasn't as prepared as Aimgakure, or the two forces aren't sharing all of their information. Sarutobi grunted his agreement and nodded. "Let us hope it's the latter, because that means they're divided, and a divided force is almost always easier to deal with. We could have a spy among us." Kakashi only nodded, his eyes tired and muffled through his mask. "Is Naruto safe? Is he somewhere they won't find him?" "He's as safe as I can make him," Sarutobi replied, indicating that the subject be dropped. "Hello, Hokage-sama," Kakashi said quietly, bowing his head. "What are your plans if we do have a spy?" Sarutobi lifted his gaze from the map and locked it on Kakashi for a few moments. "Do you believe we do?" The copy nin took a moment to respond, his face hidden behind two masks. "Yes." The old Hokage sighed and sagged slightly in his seat. "We must reclaim the Hokage Tower. We have the Iwa forces on the run and have retaken the main gate. But the tower is too valuable to leave in Aimgakure's hands for long. But first, we must eliminate this spy. Any effort will be undermined because of him. Find the spy by any means necessary." Kakashi nodded and turned away from the room, bowing to the Hokage. He needed the break from the battlefield because he was running dangerously low on chakra, but this new assignment presented him with an entirely new set of problems. Heading back to the emergency shelter, Kakashi set his mind on how to devise a trap for a spy. "So, what did you discover?" Minato inquired as he shut the door to the first-floor spare office. The room hadn't been used in years and was covered in dust, as were many of the second-floor spare bedrooms. Jiraiya could only manage a quick privacy seal before Minato lost control of his curiosity. Tsunade muttered to herself as she ran her hand over a dusty box. "You'd think we'd be able to communicate in your regular office. It could be more convenient." Minato shook his head, but Jiraiya had already answered. "It's still too sloppy. Our illustrious Hokage has a hard time storing all of his books and scrolls." Minato rolled his eyes at Jiraiya's dry tone. Sensei, you used to be much better at that, Rin chided, and now that Naruto-kun is staying with you, you need to set a good example. Minato made a quick, jerking motion with his head. I'm looking into it. Can we now return to what's going on with Naruto? Fine, Sudi huffed after a long sigh. Nonetheless, you owe me an explanation for how and why he's here. You claim he's your son without explaining how that's possible. The only reason I didn't make you take a temporary leave of absence is because Jiraiya is here to support you and you've already taken the day off from work. Minato opened his mouth to respond when a hollow tapping interrupted him. The group turned to face the window, only to discover a one-eyed, white-haired ninja crouching on the windowsill outside. Minato unlocked the window and slid it open for Kakashi to pass through. The Hokage's lips pursed in disapproval. I thought I told you to return tomorrow, Minato said as he closed and relatched the window. I took a nap, Kakashi explained. He walked over to Rin and sat down next to her, leaning against a large box. Who can sleep when there's an unidentified miniature clone of their sensei running around his house? I'm guessing it has to do with that mirror. What kind of mirror? Tsunade inquired, turning to face Minato. Minato sighed, knowing he wouldn't get any more information about Naruto's medical condition until he explained. I attempted to recreate Sandame's seeing crystal months ago. In my experiments, I unintentionally created a window into another version of our own world, another possible outcome of events. The Sandame was still alive in that world, even though I was dead. We've been corresponding for several months. Have you talked to Sarutobi-sensei? Tsunade was taken aback and asked, how do you know it wasn't a trick? I took great care in verifying his identity. I sat in on one of the conversations as well, Kakashi said, and the Sandame had no idea I was listening in. But I believe he was who he claimed to be. Tsunade gave a skeptical hum in response. Her arms were crossed and her face was expressionless, but she didn't say anything, so Minato continued. I went down 2 nights ago to see if the Sandame was available for a conversation. When I entered the room with the mirror, I discovered Naruto on the floor, unconscious and wounded. The mirror was not activated, but there was no other way for him to enter the room. Later interrogation confirmed that he is from the other Konoha. Minato paused, remembering the Kyuubi he had sealed in his son. He didn't want to tell anyone what his other self had done, perhaps out of shame. He had serious doubts about his ability to keep it a secret. After all, Jiraiya already knew. He didn't need to say anything right now because Kakashi was already speaking. That explains why he looks so much like you. You never mentioned having a son in that other place. I didn't know I had a son there until he showed up, Minato explained. How could Sensei not tell you about him? Tsunade inquired, her eyes narrowed and a frown tugging at her mouth. As I previously stated, I am no longer alive in that world. Naruto was born as an orphan. You've probably noticed that he doesn't even recognize me. Keeping the pain sting out of his words was more difficult than Minato anticipated. But he succeeded. Do you now have the exam results? Tsunade did not respond right away. The rest of the room was silent as she stared at him and he stared at her. Yes, she said finally, not moving from her position against the boxes. His stomach has an unusual chakra signature that is not his. If I had to guess, I'd say something has been sealed into the boy. Tsunade cast a sidelong glance at Minato, causing the younger man to sigh. He has the Kyuubi no Yoko sealed within him, Minato admitted after a brief pause. He had no doubt that the other people in the room would treat Naruto the same way, but he didn't want the word to get out. The villagers would not be so understanding. The space was deafeningly quiet. The question of who had sealed the Kyuubi lingered in the air, but thankfully no one asked, and Minato stubbornly refused to answer unless specifically asked. So that played out differently in the other world as well. Kakashi mused, his one visible eye furrowed above his black face mask. That would explain the foreign chakra, Rin nodded, turning as Tsunade spoke. It answers the first question but not the second. Second? Minato inquired, alarmed at the prospect of 3 distinct chakra signatures in one person, particularly his son. Coping with 1 foreign chakra for an extended period of time was taxing on the body, but 2. He had no idea how that would affect someone. And Naruto was still so young. Tsunade's next remark did nothing to assuage Minato's concerns. His other chakra is located in his head. It was very quiet, almost non-existent. I would have missed it if it hadn't flared briefly as I was scanning his head. Tsunade stated the facts in a clinical and level tone. Did it appear dangerous? Jiraiya inquired, a frown on his face. The chakra itself isn't malicious, unlike the Kyuubi's, but the demon fox is imprisoned. It is mostly contained and separated from Naruto's own chakra. This other chakra, on the other hand, is not. From what I can tell, it's affecting him directly, though I'm not sure how or to what extent. Minato did not like the sound of that. He resisted his initial instinct to return to his son, if only to ensure Naruto's safety, and forced himself to think. It's in his head and dormant most of the time, he inquired, his mind racing over the possible causes of the other chakra. Tsunade gave a nod. Maybe some kind of genjutsu, Rin suggested, echoing Minato's initial guess. It's possible, Tsunade agreed, but without making any promises. Minato frowned at the ground, his mind racing with the new information. All he seemed to get were new questions and never definitive answers. Naruto's unexpected appearance, the Kyuubi, Naruto's reaction to the mirror, the partial seals in his pictures, and now this second foreign chakra in his head were all new puzzle pieces that few were connecting in any clear way. He had no doubt they were all related to one another, but the question was how. What was safe and what could be dangerous? He had no way of knowing for sure, given the limited information they had. Do you still have those drawings, Sensei? Minato inquired. They were outlining everything about Naruto, and it would be beneficial to have as many perspectives on the information as possible. Jiraiya took out the slightly creased drawings. He flipped through them, selecting the best examples and putting them on top. Tsunade approached him and peered over at the topmost image, intrigued. These were drawn earlier by Naruto, Minato explained as the head medic reached out and took the first image in the stack. Jiraiya gave Kakashi and Rin 2 more drawings. For a few moments, silence reigned as the three examined the drawings, and Minato wondered who would see it first. None of the others were seal masters on the level of his or Jiraiya, but they were accomplished and learned enough to distinguish between seal markings and scribbles. Don't tell me, Kakashi said, his pronounced frown visible through his face mask's black material. The expression quickly changed to one of surprise. Those are seal parts. He looked up to Minato for confirmation, even though the Hokage could tell his former student didn't need it. Tsunade and Rin's faces lit up with recognition as Minato nodded. What is a seal for? Rin inquired, her gaze drawn to the drawing with increasing intensity as her eyes ran over the out-of-place markers. There's no way to tell without the entire seal, Jiraiya explained as he returned the drawings. We'll try to piece it together as much as we can from the sections we have, but there's no way of knowing for sure if these are even from the same seal. Minato agreed with a nod, and any we manage to piece together will be pure speculation on our part. The only way we'll know we have the right seal is to try it, which won't be possible unless we find the hand seals for it. He cleared his throat, concerned that he was sounding overly pessimistic. But we'll try, Minato concluded, to Jiraiya's amusement. Yes, we'll try, Jiraiya says, tucking the pictures into his pockets and crossing his arms. He cocked his head and spoke in a light tone. And we'll figure it out because I'm the best seal master around and Minato-kun is fine. He finished with a shrug and a waggle of his hand. Minato ignored the friendly jab on purpose, not wanting to encourage his sensei any further. Unfortunately, even if we find the correct seal, it won't answer all of our questions. Have you considered contacting the Sandaime again? Tsunade inquired, ignoring Jiraiya. As he agreed, Minato nodded and sighed. That, I believe, is the only way we'll truly learn what happened. Naruto doesn't know anything, and what he does know he doesn't understand well enough to communicate effectively. We could try after Naruto-kun goes to bed tonight, Kakashi suggested. You both were always working late. Minato deliberated for a moment before nodding. But I'd like you and Rin to stay and keep an eye on Naruto. Nobody should know he's here, but you never know. Rin bobbed her head, and Kakashi replied, Hello, Hokage-sama. His voice didn't show any dissatisfaction with being left out of the meeting or excitement about spending time with Naruto. How will you explain his presence? Tsunade inquired, a skeptical expression on her face. Do you intend to simply return him to his own world when all is said and done? The other Konoha may not give up their Jinchuriki so easily, and they have a way of entering our world while we have no idea how to cross to theirs. This gives them a significant advantage if a fight breaks out. Minato shifted his position, resisting the urge to wipe his face. When he responded, he couldn't help but cool his tone and harden his face. I believe we have other issues to address before we tackle that. There's no need for borrowing trouble, Jiraiya quietly agreed. Jiraiya frowned at the papers that were strewn about him. They spilled onto the floor and covered his bed on the second floor of the Hokage's mansion. At first glance, the papers appeared to be nothing more than a smattering of children's scribbles strewn randomly across the bedspread. But the drawings were carefully arranged based on the partial seal found in Naruto's pictures. Naruto sat on the floor with the newer drawings he had finished while the adults were talking. They contained no buried seals. Jiraiya assumed it was because of Naruto's concentration and focus while drawing them. The boy hadn't been paying attention in the earlier doodles, which most likely allowed whatever was buried in his head to seep through to the casual drawings. Naruto had clearly tried to make the best pictures he could with the new drawings, touching, but ultimately ineffective for the purpose for which they had assigned the boy to draw. Minato could possibly tack them to a wall somewhere in the house. Fortunately, there was enough to go around in the other drawings for the time being. Jiraiya thought he recognized some of his old sensei's work based on those fragments. Given Naruto's proximity to and relationship with the Sandaime, it would make sense to find Sarutobi sensei's seal in the boy's head. Even so, it didn't explain why the seal was there in the first place. Without a doubt, if he knew what the seal did, he would know why it was buried in Naruto, or have a very good guess. A burst of laughter rang out through the door, followed by a stampede of feet down the hall and stairs. Jiraiya smiled up at the closed door, causing crow's feet to form at the corners of his eyes. He hadn't heard laughter in this house in a long time, and he was grateful for that alone. His smile faded as his gaze shifted to the scroll open across his lap. Minato discovered the seal on Naruto's stomach. It was very similar to a seal Minato had worked on years before, but as the Hokage pointed out, it had several important changes that were never made in their world. Minato had intended to go over the two versions of the seal in detail on his own, but with Naruto constantly around, the new father was understandably distracted, so he gave Jiraiya both variations of the seal to examine and compare along with the drawings. The original was spread out on its own scroll to the side, ready for quick reference when needed. The front door opened and closed, leaving the house suddenly quiet and breaking Jiraiya's tenuous concentration. They would have to come up with an explanation for Naruto or be prepared to tell the truth soon, or else the boy would be confined to the immediate vicinity of the house for an extended period of time. Jiraiya refocused on the seal, knowing that Minato wouldn't let Naruto get too far away from the house, taking advantage of the silence while he could. He thought he understood all of the modifications, especially when compared to the original seal. The majority of them concentrated on recycling chakra through the host, most likely so Naruto could use the fox's chakra if necessary. The amount of bleed-off permitted appeared to be much greater than on the few other Jinchuriki seals he'd seen in his life. But there was one thing that bothered him. It wasn't the seal itself. He couldn't find any theoretical flaws in its construction. Seals occasionally had unanticipated side effects that were not and could not be predicted until they were used, especially if they were new and untested. The Kyuubi's chakra complicated Naruto's seal even more. For lack of a better word, the demon fox's chakra was corrosive. Jiraiya was unsure what would happen if he let the Kyuubi's chakra filter out of the seal for an extended period of time. Would it weaken the seal? It was difficult to put his finger on it, but something about the entire setup made him uneasy. Jiraiya frowned as he returned his thoughts to Kushina and how she had dealt with the Kyuubi all those years. He didn't think about Kushina all that much. He had preferred not to think about her tragic death and its impact on his student, but his mind was now sifting through everything he could recall. Her seal was distinct from Naruto's. Its main goal was to keep the Kyuubi as hidden as possible from the rest of the world and anyone who might try to use it for their own gain. Naruto's appeared to be designed with the intention of the boy one day using the Kyuubi's power as freely as his own. Kushina's seal had also been heavily reliant on her unique chakra. Jiraiya didn't know much about Naruto's chakra, but it might have a unique resistance to the Kyuubi's. The Sannin found it difficult to believe it didn't, given that the boy had spent his entire life with the Kyuubi and had possibly inherited his mother's ability. Still, Naruto was only 8 years old and had little control over his chakra. The hypothesis would be difficult to test. Jiraiya sighed and returned his gaze to the unknown seals that surrounded him. He'd been switching between the two for the past hour, constantly encountering the same problems. Simply put, there wasn't enough information. The mystery seal was incomplete, and he didn't want to ruin Minato and Naruto's fun. They'd have to take a closer look at Naruto's chakra and its reaction to the Kyuubi's chakra at some point. They'd also have to see if there was another way to get to the seal buried inside the boy's head, as well as check on the other chakra Tsunade had detected. But that could wait for now. Jiraiya could hear Naruto's happy voice rising and falling below on the first floor, offsetting Minato's more subdued responses. They sounded like they were in the kitchen, and Jiraiya hoped Minato wasn't trying to cook or teach Naruto how to cook. Jiraiya shivered as he heard the pots clatter to the floor. He could picture Minato in the kitchen with Naruto right now, fantasizing about a home-cooked meal. If all else failed, they could always order something from a restaurant. Jiraiya took out a new scroll, determined to distract himself and solve at least one of the mysteries before him. He could find the most likely connections for them if he copied over the disparate sections of the unknown seal. There was still time before dinner, not to mention the time it would take to order takeout if Minato's attempts at cooking downstairs failed. Then, if he wanted, he'd have a few hours after dinner to work on it some more before they put Naruto to bed and headed over to the Hokage Tower. During that time, Jiraiya reasoned, he'd be able to figure out some of the possible connections between the various sections. It was all speculation, but it was better than nothing. Naruto was having another nightmare. It was not like the first night in the new world. That nightmare had been a memory, and while some distant part of his brain realized it, the fear that filled him was almost as bad as the memory itself. The setting was still the same, as was the beginning of the attack, but this time the ANBU never arrived to save him. He was being pursued by an unknown enemy shinobi at one point. Then he turned to see a horde of enraged villagers following him. They pursued him, believing he was responsible for the attack that was still going on around them. Buildings were burning everywhere, and no matter where Naruto turned down the streets and alleyways, he couldn't escape. The worst part, however, was not the villagers' screams of terror or rage. Konoha was gripped by something other than the growing sounds of battle and chaos. It wasn't even the mobs or the enemy shinobi who would sometimes catch up with Naruto. The red mist was the most terrifying, the worst part of his nightmare. It followed him wherever he went, skirting the street edge when the villagers and shinobi were present, then closing in when he was alone. It licked his arms and legs, stinging and scorching his skin. Naruto sensed the malice and anger in the red mist, as well as the power. He was terrified. Naruto ran away from the mist rather than the people chasing him. When it crept in close and cornered him, he flailed against it. But there was nothing he could do. It licked against his skin as it reached out to him. It seemed to grow over time, until he could feel it grabbing at his arms. He cried out in desperation, hoping that the villagers would find him and keep it at bay. SHH. It's fine, I'll be right there. Naruto was startled awake by the voice, causing him to twist and jerk away from the restraints. It wasn't until later that he realized the restraints weren't the red mist closing in on him or the villagers squeezing him. They were arms wrapped around him, gently but firmly. Naruto paused his struggle, if only out of surprise, and caught the stream of words above him. You're all right, you're safe here. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. Minato was the one. The Hokage had wrapped his arms around Naruto and pulled him into a hug, supporting Naruto's upper half in his lap. The dream's shock and lingering desperation kept Naruto from tensing at the close contact, instead turning his face and shoulders into the man's stomach. Minato's arms tightened around Naruto's shoulders, pulling him up into the man's lap even further. Naruto drew his arms into his chest, unable to make himself hug the man back, but pressed himself against the reassuring presence beside him. Minato responded by squeezing Naruto even tighter and rocking them back and forth as he continued his reassuring litany. Naruto's breathing became labored, but he refused to cry. Instead, he squeezed his eyes shut and concentrated on shaking off the shaky feeling from the dream. As he tried to draw air past whatever was blocking his throat, it sent tremors down his limbs and made his breath shudder. The gentle rocking motion also didn't seem to help at first. Initially, it made him want to cry even more, but the slow, steady motion eventually relieved the knot in Naruto's chest. Naruto reveled in the security and comfort of the embrace for a few moments, even as another part of him floundered at the unfamiliarity of it all. The rocking gradually came to a halt, and Minato paused for a moment before asking, "Better?" Naruto simply nodded into the Hokage's chest, unable to look up due to embarrassment. As Minato took another breath, neither of them moved from their positions. "Would you like to talk about it?" Naruto shook his head slowly, more out of habit than in response to the question. In any case, he didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to have to explain to Minato that the villagers had always despised him, that he had always been alone. Who was to say that if Minato found out, he wouldn't change his mind about Naruto as well? "Are you certain?" Minato inquired, pulling back to look down and craning his neck to look into Naruto's face. "Talking about it is beneficial." Naruto considered it again. He'd never tried talking about his nightmares to anyone before, unless you count the 2 days before when he told Minato and Jiraiya about his dream memory, and he hadn't had any nightmares that night. Normally, he'd be overjoyed to have someone to talk to about anything. But now that the first few panicked moments of waking had passed, the awkwardness of the situation was beginning to creep in. Even as drowsiness tugged at his eyes, he became nervous. If he had to guess, he'd say Minato was feeling a little awkward, judging by the way the man shifted in his seat as the quiet minutes passed with neither of them speaking. Naruto crawled out of Minato's arms and back under the covers with one more silent shake of his head. The night was cold, and he delighted in burrowing beneath the heavy blankets. The bed here was nice and soft, despite the fact that it smelled a little like dust and caused his nose to twitch at first. It was far superior to his previous apartment, which had a sagging mattress and thin blankets. Minato drew the blankets up higher, revealing only Naruto's face and mop of hair. The gesture helped calm Naruto's nerves caused by the nightmare, and he relaxed back into bed, ready to sleep again. If you change your mind, I'll be more than willing to listen, Minato said through the blankets, resting a hand on Naruto's shoulder. Naruto nodded again, his eyes blinking furiously. Even if he didn't intend to accept the offer, the gesture was appreciated. I have to go back to the Hokage Tower to take care of something. But Kakashi will be here if you need anything, okay? Naruto could only manage a partial nod before falling asleep due to the heavy warmth surrounding him. Minato shifted the covers over Naruto, glad he hadn't left the house right after putting Naruto to bed that night. It was still early in the evening, and he didn't usually talk with the Sandaime until much later, so there was no rush to leave. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching his son's chest slowly rise and fall as Naruto sank deeper into sleep and, hopefully, better dreams. Minutes passed and Minato remained motionless, the image seared into his mind. If something went wrong and prevented Naruto from staying, he wanted to have as many memories from these moments as possible. He knew it would be painful to look back on them, but it would be better than not having them at all. Minato didn't know how long he sat there, enjoying the silence, with only Naruto's soft breathing to break it. The light streaming in from the lit hallway was cut by a shadow. He didn't have to look up to see his sensei's outline sketched out on the floor. "Is everything okay?" Jiraiya inquired, leaning against the door frame, arms crossed. Minato could hear the other questions that were hidden within the first. The older man was just as interested in Minato as he was in Naruto. "Yeah," Minato said, rubbing his hands over his thighs and rising to his feet. "I've just made sure he got back to sleep without incident." Jiraiya's tone was even, and his face was cast in shadow by the hall light, so Minato could only see an outline. "Kakashi will be here if there are any issues." "I know, but I just want to be certain." Minato rose slowly to his feet and took one last look at his son before silently exiting the room. He moved slowly and carefully to close the door behind him. He refused to tell me anything about his nightmare. His disappointment was more audible in his voice than he had hoped. Jiraiya shrugged, directing the Hokage down the hall to the stairwell. "What do you anticipate? This is still new to the kid, and you are new to the kid. It will take time." When Minato did not respond immediately, Jiraiya sighed and patted his shoulder, repeating sympathetically, "Give it some time." "But what if I don't have that time?" Minato responded with a frown. He shook his head, quickening his pace and depriving his sensei of the opportunity to respond. Kakashi slouched against the wall at the bottom of the stairs, one eye fixed on the two men coming down from the second floor. Rin stood nearby, pretending to be interested in a landscape hanging on the wall. She turned around and watched them as they walked up the stairs. "How is he getting along?" Moving to the bottom of the staircase across from Kakashi, Rin inquired. It sounded like he was upset. "Nightmare," Minato replied, grateful for Rin's concern and glad she had agreed to join Kakashi on guard duty. She had a full schedule as a medical nin, and he hadn't wanted to put any additional demands on her at first, but she'd appeared with Kakashi a few hours after the two had left Naruto's medical examination. "He's sleeping again, and hopefully he won't have any more problems throughout the night." "Don't worry, Sensei," Rin said cheerfully, "we'll take care of him." Minato hesitated at the door and nodded. He knew his two remaining students would defend Naruto with their lives if necessary, and Rin could handle another nightmare, but he still looked for a reason to postpone the fight a little longer. Jiraiya sighed exasperatedly beside him, slapped him on the shoulder, and pushed him to the door. "We'll be back, probably late," Jiraiya said as they stepped out onto the dimly lit front walk. The door shut behind them, obliterating the bright light from the front hall. Minato rolled his eyes at his sensei for being pushed out the door, but he couldn't blame him. Jiraiya would be able to see his sensei for the first time in years if everything went well. Minato would understandably be eager if he were in his shoes. Minato accelerated his pace and turned down the road without looking back. He jumped onto a small wooden stand and pushed off, Jiraiya close behind him, to travel over the rooftops. Tsunade was waiting for them at the tower's front door. She stood under the entrance lights, arms crossed and a mild frown on her face, tapping her foot. "About time," she grumbled as they landed in front of her on the steps. "Something came up," Minato said, but the medic didn't wait for him to finish speaking before flipping her hand and turning to go inside. "If you say so," she said, pulling open the doors, only to come to a halt just inside the building. "Where exactly is it?" "It's in the lower levels," Minato said after he and Jiraiya had entered and the door had been closed. Tsunade nodded and fell in step behind Minato as he made his way to the stairwell. Due to the late hour, the lights were dimmed and the halls were quiet. For those working late, the lamps were turned on in a few offices. They moved quickly through the hall and down the stairs. The lower levels were lit similarly dimly and sounded as quiet as at any other time of day. No one said anything until they got to the door and Minato ran through the long sequence of hand signs to let them in. Minutes passed as he deactivated each security measure with care. His arms were tired by the end, and Tsunade's brows had risen toward her blonde hair. "Well, at least you're not taking any chances with security," she remarked dryly, arms crossed again in front of her. "Some of those I added after I found Naruto," Minato admitted, "because I didn't think there was any possible way to travel through it. But now that I've been proven wrong, I've increased the security I already had in place. Like that guard I noticed," Tsunade observed as they entered the room. Minato simply nodded, unsurprised that she had noticed the ANBU he had stationed to keep an eye on the door at all times. The interior of the room was mostly the same as when they left it. Thankfully, the stain on the floor had been removed. Minato hadn't done it, nor had he allowed anyone else into the room to do it, so it had to be Jiraiya, the village's only other seal master skilled enough to deactivate the complex security seals without setting off the alarms. Jiraiya had also been the last to reseal the room after they had brought Naruto down to bring forth some of his memories. "You might want to put a guard inside the room," Tsunade suggested, her voice half distracted by the mirror in the center of the room. "It's better to prevent them from entering at all than to let them in, even if only into this one room. After all, we don't know what they're capable of. They might be more skilled than we anticipated." Minato considered the idea, tilting his head to the side in acknowledgement. "I thought about it. That would imply allowing more than Minato and myself access to the room." Jiraiya frowned. "Do we want more people to be able to get in?" "That's what I'm curious about," Minato admitted. He gave Tsunade a few moments to examine herself in the mirror before motioning for her to move to the side. He felt nervous about opening the window as he stepped up in front of the chakra glass. He had no idea what he would find on the other side, but a part of him was skeptical that it would be his predecessor. Minato took a deep breath and calmed himself before running through the long string of hand seals to unlock and open the mirror. The light flashed across the glassy surface before settling to reveal the world beyond Minato's. As he looked into the other room, he frowned. On the other side of the mirror, there was a figure, but it was not the Sandaime. After working tirelessly day and night, the seal breakers had finally broken through the many barriers surrounding the hidden door in the Hokage Tower. A few of them had been injured or even killed while dismantling the Sandaime traps. Hokage's, but Pain was certain it was worth the sacrifice of time and men. He wasn't sure what he'd find when he went through the door, and he didn't let anyone else in before him, but his face showed no reaction to the nearly empty room revealed by their efforts. Pain hadn't been in the room long when a barrage of kunai erupted from the walls immediately flanking the door. He deflected the attack before having to dodge the second volley that came too soon after the first. As soon as he touched down, a series of explosive tags appeared on the nearest wall, and he pushed the explosion back on itself, leaving a large smoking crater on one side of the room. Pain stood ready for another attack for a few moments. Nothing happened after the explosion's dust settled. He straightened slowly, shifting his weight as he assessed the likelihood of more traps. He relaxed and took a better look around the room when nothing else happened. A quick search of the rest of the room revealed no other exits besides the one Pain had used. The once clean space was covered in a thin layer of debris, but the tall blank mirror in the center was unharmed. A quick examination of the traps and their pattern led Pain to believe that the mirror was purposefully placed out of harm's way when the traps were first set. Pain approached the mirror slowly, examining the smooth black crystal surface. With his Rinnegan, he could see an enormous amount of chakra flowing through the crystal glass, but it appeared dormant and inactive. Walking around the object, he could tell it was made of chakra crystal, but more information was elusive. There were no seals, carvings, or symbols to indicate what it did or how it worked. Conan entered the room behind him, despite the fact that everyone else had been ordered to leave. She didn't say anything, letting Pain decide how, when, and if she wanted to start the conversation. Pain spoke after several minutes of silence. "There is no other way out of this room," he said, trailing a finger down the surface of the glass to test the reaction to chakra. His reflection was dulled by the dusty surface and dim lighting in the room. There was another pause before Conan responded. Pain could see her dark outline in the glass, the brighter hallway behind her shining through the shattered doorway. "The Iwa forces are retreating," she said calmly, not showing any emotion. "We have mostly repulsed all attacks, but only because of our informant, and Konoha shinobi have been splitting themselves between our lines and Iwa's." Konoha was not expecting to still have as many high-ranking shinobi left after the initial assault, so this long drawn-out battle in the streets is not to our advantage. It was the most she had said in a long time, possibly months or even years. Her reflection didn't move as she spoke, and Payne's eyes didn't dart away from it as he came to a halt with one hand on the glass. We came here with two goals, Payne began, knowing she was well aware of both, his gaze sweeping across the crystal glass before him. The first was to neutralize Konoha's power so as to eliminate any obstruction they present to our plans, with the added benefit of cutting down Iwa's military at the same time. The second was to acquire the Kyuubi before the container learned to wield its power. If the Jinchuriki ever learned to master the Kyuubi's power, it could become problematic. The Kyuubi was brought to this level, most likely to this room, but there are no other escape routes from here. It must have something to do with this mirror. Payne continued to move around the mirror, hand trailing over the surface and drawing smooth paths in the dust-covered surface. Could we take it with us if we had to retreat? Conan asked as he moved closer to the mirror. She inquired, though her tone did not appear to anticipate an answer. Do you think our situation is that bad? Payne crouched down in the back, only half listening for her response. Konoha could not stand against us if you used your full strength, the Kunoichi said coldly. But you have already stated that you do not wish to show your full strength to the world just yet. Better to leave them floundering and blaming Iwa. Payne agreed, but that meant they could be pushed out of their stronghold if the tides of battle shifted. Neither said it, but both understood very well the dangers of limiting their strength in the battle. It will take time for the city to recover from this, and the added insecurity of relations with Iwa will only benefit us if we are pushed out of the city. Our new priority is to locate and secure the Kyuubi. As Payne finished his examination of the mirror, he stood and moved toward the door. They would have to find other sources of information about the device. It would be nearly impossible to understand in the short time they had without additional reference. Conan followed close behind, her footsteps quiet echoes of his own. They were almost to the door, about to leave when a faint noise came from behind them and light suddenly flooded into the room, adding to the few torches that remained lit. Payne turned back, looking at the mirror with Conan with renewed interest. Instead of a blank, dark surface, the mirror reflected a different, brighter room, and several new figures stared back at them. Can you tell me who you are? Demanded the first and central figure, a blond man, his face quickly changing from shock to hardened focus as his distinctive blue eyes took in both Payne and Conan. Behind the blonde stood Jiraiya-sensei and Tsunade, both of the Sannin. Payne took his time making his observations, allowing the question to linger in the air. You are the Yondaime Hokage, he finally said, choosing to ignore the opening question entirely. He recognized the deceased man from photographs he had seen and was careful to keep any surprise at the unexpected appearance at bay. Yahiko, Conan, Tsunade muttered under her breath, that kid, and Jiraiya gasped in surprise. Jiraiya-sensei, Payne acknowledged, but his attention was drawn to the mirror itself. Now that it was activated, chakra flowed freely through the crystal, marking out patterns and directions. If he could make sense of the flow, it would bring them that much closer to understanding the device and what had happened to the Kyuubi. For a brief moment, Jiraiya's voice diverted his attention as his old sensei yelled, quickly, Minato. He's observing the chakra flow with his Rinnegan. The Hokage gave Jiraiya a surprised frown before quickly running through hand signs at breakneck speed. The mirror went blank in the middle of the sequence, eliminating any chance of seeing the completed set and returning the room to half-light. The contrast of light and sound that had briefly entered the room added to the silence, and Payne continued to watch the mirror as the last rip of chakra ran through it, only speaking when the crystal was completely still again. Interesting, he said. Minato continued to stare at the mirror long after it had gone dark, and in his mind's eye, he could still see the red-headed man and his companion standing on the other side. He ran over the image several times, ensuring he committed it to memory even as he desperately tried to understand what they had been doing in that room. They had both worn the same cloak, implying some kind of organization. Oh boy, Jiraiya sighed behind him, luring Minato out of his reverie. Things just got a lot more complicated. What exactly do you mean, sensei? Who is that? Minato asked, finally turning away from the mirror and facing the older man. You seem to recognize him. I do, or I did, Jiraiya said, his face concerned and puzzled. Before I took on your training, he was one of my students during the Second Shinobi War. Two of those orphans. Tsunade scowled as she returned her gaze from the mirror to her old teammate. But I thought you said they had all died. That's what I thought, too, Jiraiya murmured, his voice dropping. But that happened before our two worlds supposedly split. Who exactly was he? The mystery of how the man had survived could be solved later, but the more pressing issue was that the other mirror had apparently fallen into enemy hands. Not long after our battle with Hanzo during the Second Shinobi War, we came across 3 orphans. They followed us and requested that we train them. I decided to stay with them and teach them ninjutsu until they were capable of looking after themselves. They were talented, all three of them, but Nagato he had the Rinnegan. Jiraiya's eyes misted over as he looked back into the past memories. The Rinnegan. That's supposed to be a myth, Minato said, surprised. He'd seen the ripple pattern in the man's eyes and it matched the stories he'd heard about the legendary Dojutsu. Plus, Jiraiya wasn't one to exaggerate about things like this, so if his old sensei said it was the Rinnegan, chances were it was. All myth is based on fact, Jiraiya shrugged. Nagato had the Rinnegan. For a while, I thought he was the child of prophecy I'd heard about, but then I heard that all three of those kids had been killed, so I assumed I was mistaken. Perhaps you should check up on them again, see if they really did die, Tsunade said, worried frown on her face. Like you said, they died before the two timelines began to differ as far as we know. I'd rather not be taken aback by someone like that. Minato returned his gaze to the mirror, picturing the man on the other side. Anyone with the Rinnegan, separated by dimensions or not, could be dangerous. He turned and moved toward the door, calling one of the ANBU guards to his side. Under no circumstances should that room be left unattended. Hello, Hokage-sama, the guard said before walking away. Jiraiya and Tsunade followed him out into the corridor, where they only had to wait a moment before the ANBU with the extra guard returned. And the extra guard slipped into the room, disappearing into the shadows. I'm going to seal the room again, Minato said to the ANBU captain. There's no way out from the inside, so keep an eye on things. You'll be the only person besides myself and Jiraiya-sensei who has the authority to open this door. The ANBU captain nodded, and Minato ran through the hand seals, sealing the room with the mirror and guard inside, before turning back down the hall. They're almost certainly after the Kyuubi inside Naruto, Minato said. There wouldn't be any other reason to be concerned about the mirror unless they were there by chance when we activated the device. Jiraiya agreed, quickening his pace to match Minato's. I need to know everything you knew about those three children, Minato said, looking at his former teacher. The information may be outdated, but it is something. I'll go over their abilities and what I taught them before I leave for Aimgakure, Jiraiya said, nodding. It's about time I double-checked what happened to those three in our world. I'll go through our records to see if we have anything on the Rinnegan itself. It's probably just rumors and legends, but anything is better than nothing, Tsunade said, crossing her arms in front of her. Thank you very much, Tsunade-sama. I believe we can never be too prepared for whatever comes our way. With much of the village in rumble, behind, or too close to enemy lines, Kakashi had been forced to make do with the little space they had, setting up emergency facilities and relocating departments where they could. The Copy Nin had determined the intel division closest to the Hokage's makeshift office to be the most likely housing a leak after looking at the most suspicious reports indicating a leak. He was making several assumptions by doing so. If the spy didn't act on every piece of intel they came across, had more connections than he realized, or some of the suspicious activities were simply coincidences, then he could very well be in the wrong area. He'd already informed the Hokage, and they'd begun subtly rechanneling vital information around the specific office to other divisions for processing. If he was incorrect, and the spy wasn't in that subdivision, they could very well be assisting the spy in gaining more intel. Still, this was Kakashi's best starting point, and it would be the ideal place for a spy to position themselves, not too high up to be easily found, but not completely out of the loop, which was why Kakashi was slowly waiting to see or hear anything that would give him any more clues. He had a list of suspects, but it was barely shorter than the number of people working or in contact with the intel office in question. The door slammed shut, making Kakashi twitch where he sat slouched against the wall. He'd started to doze off without realizing it, probably too tired from the day's constant fighting to be doing the delicate type of surveillance work he was attempting. But he had no choice. Times were desperate. Only a few exhausted people remained, napping on blankets folded on the floor. Several of the remainders were people on his short list of suspects, so Kakashi remained where he was, eyeing each in turn. Footsteps in the hall caught Kakashi's attention, and he turned his attention to listen to the passers-by, who came from the direction of the intel office in question, and he tuned his ears to hear the muffled voices. Almost 19 hours without a break, one female voice grumbled, and Kakashi recognized the voice but couldn't place it. I can't wait for this nightmare to end. In a situation like this, we can only do our best, another male voice sighed, resignedly. Everyone's working overtime now. Not Kyo, he's been taking breaks at the oddest times, the first voice complained, muttering lower than before. Thankfully the pair were drawing closer to the break room and Kakashi could still hear despite the drop in volume. Nothing was said, and he was gone. Oh, he's so inconsiderate. Kakashi's ears perked up slightly, but he didn't show any interest in the nearly empty room. Kyo stays late to work, too, and things are so crazy now everyone is running around. Even our department has been divided into different offices and floors. He could be running around to different offices like I was doing for half the day. The final few words were forced through a yawn that lasted past the statement. The Kunoichi simply huffed in disbelief, but did not respond, and their footsteps moved down the hallway away from Kakashi in the break room. Kakashi pondered the sporadic disappearances. An erratic break schedule was hardly proof, considering how everything had been thrown out of balance since the attack began. But Kakashi didn't have much else to go on and his gut told him to look closer. Ignoring the stiffness that had settled into his limbs from hours on the floor, Kakashi pushed himself to his feet. "Naruto-kun, how are you?" Naruto twitched at the sudden sound but didn't respond, instead staring at the two shadows cast by the hall light against the wall, one of which was Rin's voice, and the other was Kakashi due to the man's wild hair. "We know you're awake," Rin said gently as she approached the bedside. "Did you have another nightmare?" Rin asked. Naruto rolled over and looked to the door, blinking in the bright light that streamed into the room. Rin was standing next to the bed, bending over as she looked down at him, and Kakashi leaned against the door frame, reading from a book. Shifting his gaze back to Rin, Naruto tried not to fidget as she drew his blanket back up to his chin from where it had fallen. He didn't like people towering over him. It happened often enough, considering how short he was, and he was used to it when he was up on his feet. Then, at least, he could fight or run away if he needed to, but lying down made him feel much more vulnerable. Rin returned her gaze to Kakashi, and the hall light briefly illuminated her uncertain expression before she turned back and her expression was hidden in shadow once more. She stepped back to the foot of the bed before slowly sitting down on the mattress edge, and Naruto unconsciously relaxed at the extra space between them. "We thought we heard you having a nightmare," Rin said, her voice gentler than before, as if she expected him to break if she spoke too loudly. The silence stretched as Naruto stared at her, unsure what to say. Earlier, when Minato had woken him from his nightmare, he'd almost cried into the man's shoulder and taken his comfort. But he'd been caught off guard after suddenly waking up. Normally, he wouldn't do that for anyone, or perhaps it was because he'd never had the chance. There was also something different about Minato. Maybe it was because the Hokage was the first person he'd met in the new world and had taken care of him, or maybe it was because he was with his longtime hero in the flesh, but Naruto felt safe with him. It wasn't quite the same as being with the Sandaime, but it wasn't completely different either, and it made Minato seem less like a stranger even though they'd only met days before. "I'm fine," Naruto said finally, aware that both adults were still waiting for an answer. He'd dealt with nightmares on his own before, and he could do it again. "Talking about it helps, you know," Kakashi said, sounding bored but echoing Minato's earlier statement. Holding his book in front of him but staring at Naruto with a sidelong glance, head tilted slightly toward the bed. Naruto shook his head, a smile on his face. "No, it's fine. I'm all right." Even with a shadow covering her face, Naruto could tell Rin was frowning because he could hear it in her voice. "We'll be right there." She stepped out of bed, smoothing the covers briefly before walking to the door, past Kakashi into the hall. "Do you want us to send Minato-sensei up when he returns?" Kakashi asked, raising his head from his book. "He should return soon." Naruto shook his head. Part of him liked the idea of Minato reappearing, but another part, accustomed to sleeping alone in an apartment for the last several years, resisted. Kakashi shrugged and began to close the door, but Naruto stopped him. "Don't close it all the way," he said quickly. The ANBU looked at him before shrugging again and leaving the door open a crack. Kakashi disappeared down the hall, his and Rin's footsteps padding quietly toward the stairs mixed with their hushed whispers. Naruto relaxed back into the bed, pulling the covers tighter around himself and shifting around to a more comfortable position, though he wasn't planning on sleeping anytime soon. It was the same dream again, with the attack, the mob, and the red mist. The fear stayed with him even when he was awake, and he didn't want to risk falling back into the center of it by going back to sleep right away. The truly terrifying aspect of the dream, however, was the red mist. Sitting in his bed, Naruto knew the mob wouldn't attack him. The people in this village weren't angry at him in the least, and no one knew he was there in the first place. Plus, there were 2 guards just downstairs who seemed willing to defend or help him if needed. The red mist Naruto had never encountered or even heard of before, but he couldn't shake off the feeling it gave him. It was like it was following him out of his dreams and into the waking world, hanging just out of sight. Looking around, Naruto scanned the corners of the room half expecting to see it there, hanging like it had in the dream. The room was empty though, free of any misread or otherwise. The light from the hall certainly helped, Naruto thought as he settled back staring at his narrow view into the hall. He could almost feel the phantom malice still hanging around the darkest corners of the room. It reminded him of his first few nights in his apartment, huddled in bed and frightened of his new surroundings. It almost made him change his mind about Minato coming up again. Almost. Naruto resisted the impulse, though. Perhaps it was out of habit, but he couldn't imagine himself calling for help for nothing more than a dream. He'd been dealing with bad dreams and worse on his own for years, and a part of him couldn't help but wonder when he'd have to go back to that. The last several days with Minato and the growing group of people he'd encountered was nice, but no one had ever stayed in his life for long. It was only a matter of time before they grew tired of him or left for whatever reason. Maybe they would just send him back to his own village. In the back of his head, Naruto felt a faint itch at the thought. Whatever happened, Naruto couldn't imagine any of them being there permanently, which meant he couldn't let himself get too attached. He liked being here with everyone. For the first time, it felt like he was a part of a family like the ones he saw his classmates with back home. Having this glimpse and losing it would be painful enough without getting more involved. Besides, Naruto told himself, the Hokage would have more important things to do than sit by his bedside all night. With that last thought, he curled his knees into his chest and prepared for the long wait till dawn. Naruto-kun. Breakfast. The call startled Naruto awake, making him tumbled from his bed to the floor in a heap of blankets. Slowly righting himself, he rubbed the growing bump on his head where he'd hit the floor. Too early, he grumbled to himself as he looked around the sunlit room blearily. He must have fallen asleep at some point after Rin and Kakashi left. Naruto-kun. The voice was coming from the bottom of the stairs now. Common. Naruto yelled back, still rubbing his eye as he stifled another yawn. Hurry up before it gets cold. Naruto pushed himself to his feet, still moaning from being woken up. Yeah. He shuffled down the hall and stairs, still yawning and scratching his head. He didn't need to see himself in the hall mirror to know his hair was sticking up all over. He hitched up the pajama pants Minato had gotten him before pushing open the swinging door and dragging himself into the kitchen. Good morning, Naruto-kun. Minato chuckled, making Naruto blink up at his surroundings. Minato sat at the table dressed in his blue ninja uniform, a large coffee mug steaming in front of him. He was smiling down at Naruto with a wide grin and amusement lighting his eyes. Rin stood at the stove, apron around her waist and spatula in hand. A frying pan with pancakes cooking was on the burner next to her. Food? Naruto asked, immediately perking up at the sounds and smells of cooking coming from the pan. Can I have ramen today? That's hardly breakfast, Rin said, flipping over a pancake once more before adding it to a plate next to her. She poured more batter into the pan, causing a new round of sizzling to fill the room. But I like ramen, Naruto complained. He pulled out another chair at the table, glancing only briefly at several burnt and oily pancakes in the trash by the door. That explained the faint burning smell that vaguely hung in the room. Rin noticed the glance and snorted. Minato-sensei started the pancakes. I had to step in if we wanted anything eatable for breakfast. The first few are always burnt, Minato muttered, sliding down in his seat as he brought up his mug. You always liked my cooking out in the field. Not much you can do to make field rations worse, sensei, Rin replied as she placed a plate down in front of Naruto. Naruto eyed the steaming pancakes with equal parts hungry anticipation and longing for his favorite meal. He can make ramen, Naruto said. He made some for me yesterday. He reached for the syrup on the table. Pouring boiling water into instant ramen doesn't count as cooking, Naruto-kun, Rin said as she returned with a fork. Minato huffed, slouching farther before he pushed himself upright. If that's what you think, you can make me another plate. If I have enough batter left, Rin muttered, rolling her eyes. Smiling at the easy interaction, Naruto looked around the room as he ate through his breakfast. The kitchen was less formal than the entry hall, though a couple days ago it had been almost bare of food and only slightly less dusty than the rest of the house. They had cleaned the long counter running along the far wall, scrubbing the wooden surface within an inch of its life to make it suitable for cooking again. Then they'd filled the cabinets beneath the counter and fridge with some groceries Jiraiya bought before adding more groceries Minato had to get to supplement the drunk food Jiraiya had brought home. The line of small windows above the counter and two larger windows behind the table had also been washed, allowing the morning sunlight to stream through and light the room unhindered. Looking around again, Naruto realized who was missing from the table. Where's the old pervert and Kakashi-san? He asked, using the nickname he'd decided for Jiraiya the day before after seeing the source of the Sanin's main source of income when Minato had stepped out for a moment. Somehow, he doubted respectable shinobi were supposed to make their money from publishing erotic romance novels. Minato snorted, choking on his coffee before gulping it down. He fought between laughing and coughing to clear his throat as he looked at Naruto with streaming eyes. "How did you come up with that name?" Minato choked out after regaining his voice. "What else am I supposed to call someone who writes porn novels and spends half his time planning on how to spy on women?" Naruto asked. Half of him was really curious. He said when things blew over he was going to use me to pick up girls. Jiraiya said he was a great ninja, but if he needed a kid to trap women into talking to him, Naruto doubted how great the man could really be. Rin whirled around from the stove brandishing her spatula like a weapon. "He showed you those books?" she asked, almost seething. It was the angriest Naruto had ever seen her and made him stop his eating, looking at the medical nin with wide eyes. He decided he didn't want to see her get really angry. Suddenly unsure which was the best way to answer, he only nodded slightly before adding, "He didn't let me read them, as if I'd want to anyway." Bleg, shaking his head at the thought, he focused back on his half-finished meal. Rin scowled, turning back to her cooking with vicious mutterings under her breath. "I knew I shouldn't have left you alone with him," Minato muttered from next to him. But seeing as all he brought back for groceries was alcohol and snacks, Minato shook his head. Jiraiya-sensei had to leave the village for a little while. He'll be back in maybe a week or two. On one of his researching trips, Naruto asked, the skepticism clear in his voice. "Oh, he told you about those too, did he?" Minato asked as Rin tapped her spatula against the stovetop impatiently. "Well, this is for actual research. What I mean is he's looking into a serious matter." Minato's expression darkened for a moment before forcibly clearing. It was so quick Naruto doubted it had really happened. Then Minato was speaking again, though he'll probably do some personal side research on the way. "Sensei, you shouldn't be talking about that sort of thing in front of an 8-year-old. Rin dropped a plate with one pancake on it in front of Minato. Well, he obviously already knows Minato started before giving up. He frowned down at his plate. "I wanted more than this." "Well, too bad. I'm saving some for Kakashi. He's sleeping in the other room." Rin added for Naruto's benefit. He had the second shift last night. Naruto, done with his pancakes, had been watching the back and forth with interest. "Oh," he said as Rin put another 2 pancakes on his plate. "Why does he get 2 more?" Minato asked a little petulantly, eyeing his 1 pancake. Rin didn't bother turning around as she answered from the stove. "He's a growing boy. Besides, you're the Hokage, you can't afford to get fat." Minato grumbled something in reply, but it was too low for Naruto to catch. For a moment, there was quiet as everyone focused on finishing their pancakes. Rin sat down at the other end of the table with her own plate of pancakes. She covered the few remaining and set them off to the side for Kakashi when he woke. Naruto shifted in his seat and scratched the back of his head, though it did little to relieve the growing itch. He wanted to ask what was going to happen that day. He'd been there for several days and Minato had stayed home for almost all of them, spending most of the time with Naruto, teaching him about being a ninja or playing games. Naruto loved the attention, especially when he was used to being alone so much back in his own world. It was a little strange having someone around and taking care of him, but he decided he was going to enjoy it while he could. After all, he hadn't forgotten Minato was the Hokage. Eventually the man would have to go back to work. Naruto made a conscious effort not to let his thoughts take the same dark turn they had during the night. Things seemed more promising in the daylight anyway, and he couldn't feel any lingering remnants of the nightmare that had plagued him. The bright room was empty of any hint of the red mist or the malicious feeling it brought, and the mood set by the 2 sitting at the table with him was so cheery he had difficulty even imagining something like that coming into the kitchen. Unable to take it anymore and needing a distraction from the nagging feeling in the back of his head, Naruto looked at Minato. "What are we going to do today? Can you teach me some cool new ninjutsu?" Minato hesitated before answering, and then was interrupted by a knock on the door as he opened his mouth. He stood up, moving out into the hall. Naruto hopped off his seat to follow. A short, gray-haired woman stood at the open front door holding a thick sheaf of paper. She had thick glasses and a stern expression that immediately made Naruto wary of her. "Good morning, Chiyoko-san," Minato smiled, opening the door wider to allow the woman inside. When she passed by the Hokage, Naruto saw a brief grimace flash over Minato's face before it settled into a polite expression once again. "Hokage-sama." Chiyoko bowed her head in a respectful gesture before looking Minato up and down. "I noticed you hadn't arrived at the office yet." No," Minato said, glancing back with a guilty expression to where Naruto hung by the corner to the kitchen. Naruto felt a wash of disappointment as he realized he wasn't going to be spending the day with Minato. Real life had caught up to him. "I've been having breakfast." Chiyoko followed Minato's glance and looked down at Naruto. A small frown crossed face, deepening the few wrinkles, but it passed when she looked back to Minato. I assume I don't need to remind you that the village keeps going even if you choose to take a few days off, however much they are deserved. Her voice and face softened for a moment as she said the last piece but returned to their stern expression again. If nothing else, you'll want to take care of the impressive stack of paperwork that's accumulated. Ah, yes, Minato said with a sigh, I'll be there shortly, if you would arrange the most pressing matters on top. Of course, Hokage-sama. Chiyoko gave a more formal bow before moving to the door. Her eyes landed on Naruto once more, flicking between him and Minato. The frown returned to her face as she closed the door behind her. Naruto moved from his place by the corner over to where Minato stood. You're leaving, aren't you? Sorry, Naruto-kun, Minato said as he knelt down closer to Naruto's level. His expression was so sincere Naruto almost believed him. I do have responsibilities to take care of, as much as I'd like to stay and spend more time with you. Minato's voice brightened. I'll be back for dinner, though, and maybe lunch if I can get through enough work in time. We can do something together then. Naruto shrugged, putting a smile on his face to hide his disappointment. All right. Minato stood up and moved to the closet where he grabbed his white and red Hokage jacket. Look after him, Rin-chan, he said to the kunoichi who had followed them from the kitchen. Rin nodded with a smile and Minato disappeared out the door.
So that's it for today. I will continue this story in next part. Till then, we weeb offline.